Welcome to the Kennedy Report. I'm Kennedy Hall. Archbishop Vigano gave an explosive interview to an Italian news outlet, and he spoke about the Freemasonic takeover that he believes is taking place because of the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum, among other organizations. We're going to talk about that in depth. It's a lengthy interview, so we're going to go over some of the highlights here. But before we do that, if we are going to live in an age where Freemasonic organizations are going to take over all that is near and dear to our hearts and mess with our economies, for one, we should probably think about having sound investments. Now, over the years, you've probably tried different investments in stocks and mutual funds. So you know they can be volatile and unpredictable. But with inflation running at its highest rate for 40 years, you don't want volatility or uncertainty. Being able to sleep at night knowing that your investment isn't about to crash is worth its weight in gold, pun intended, and this is where Noble Gold comes in. If you've been jumping from one investment to the next, a gold IRA with Noble Gold is perfect for you. A reliable hedge against inflation just fell into your lap. With gold, you shield your gains from taxes. You keep the real value of your wealth. You own a global asset, something tangible, and you can help protect your wealth against an economic crash. What's not to like? And this month, for every IRA above 20K, you'll get an incredible 3-ounce silver American Virtue coin completely free as a thank you, and that has a cash value to it. Call 1-877-646-5347. That's 1-877-646-5347 now to find out more, or visit noblegoldinvestments.com. That's noblegoldinvestments.com. So, Archbishop Vigano gave an interview with an Italian news outlet. And there's a lot to it. A lot of it is sort of inside baseball into Italian politics. He does begin the interview talking about his opinions on the Federal Reserve System and why the Federal Reserve System itself is actually bad for citizens with things like inflation and the sort of cartel way that monetary things take place with a central banking enterprise. And he's exactly correct on that. It was actually quite interesting to see him talk about finances in that way. I think he has before, but if you're not really familiar with Vigano's background, he comes from a very wealthy Italian family where he probably learned a lot about money because they're like mega wealthy. In addition, wealth in Europe often is very different than wealth in North America. A lot of the money in Europe is very old money, and they've been involved in Italian politics and statesmanship for a really long time, and I think his family is one of those. So he has an interesting perspective. Also, he was at the heart of trying to clean up the Vatican finances, so he really knows about the monetary goings-on of the church and how those things operate on an international level. At a certain point in the interview, though, he starts to get into the nitty-gritty of how he thinks that there is a Freemasonic push behind what has happened to Italy and the West at large. He says, "It is precisely the Catholic countries, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, that have suffered the most from the attack of the Masonic elite, which on the other hand favors the Protestant nations in which Freemasonry has ruled unchallenged for centuries. There are countries that do not tolerate Catholic nations being prosperous and competitive, independent and at peace, because this would be proof that it is possible to be good Christians, to have good and just laws, fair taxes, pro-family policies, prosperity, and peace. There must be no term of comparison. This is why they want not only the misery of the population, but also its corruption, the ugliness of vices, the cynical selfishness of profit, the enslavement to the lowest passions." I'm going to pause here. I've lived in Italy before for a significant amount of time. And I can tell you with certainty that this old expression of, the corruption of the best is the worst, Italy historically is like the heart of Christendom. And the corruption of that nation has made it go from the proverbial best to the proverbial worst when it comes to what Vigano says here about enslavement to the lowest passions. In Italy, the home of the Vatican, of the Roman Catholic Church, at night, you can basically watch hardcore pornography on public access television. This has been going on for years. It's impossible to avoid grave immodesty in that nation, both in the way that people dress, both men and women, but also in the advertisements that are permissible. It's actually shocking. I remember living there as a young man. I was 13 and 14 when I lived there, and moving from Canada to there. I mean, Canada has its problems with immorality. Let's be honest about that. But going to Italy, and it was unbelievable, the depth of the sexualization of that country. It's almost as if the heights that nation had reached as a center of Christendom, it's like the lows that the nation has reached have been commensurate with how high they were. It's almost like a one-to-one correlation. And this is exactly what we see in the Freemasonry. Vigano talking about Freemasonry challenging these countries. Just a brief history here. The Freemasonry that circulated throughout America and England is actually different than the Freemasonry historically that circulated throughout France, basically the Catholic countries, France, Italy, Spain, and Ireland. And although Ireland probably has a crossover, but in any case, this isn't to say that one Freemasonry is good and one is bad. Please don't confuse my meaning. But historically, there was the original sort of Freemasonic groups, which were loosely Protestant, kind of deist, theist, sort of believing in one creator God, took the Bible pretty seriously as an ancient text, but had these weird religious views that were blended in. But nonetheless, within that Freemasonry, you can read the charges of the Freemasons. I believe Benjamin Franklin reprinted it in the 1700s. You can actually find it online pretty easy. I had to read through it for some research. Weird religious stuff, 100%. Again, I'm not saying that Freemasonry is good. I'm just saying what it's about in a more specific sense. But the actual charges of the Freemasons in the Old English Freemasonry are very different than the charges of the Freemasonry in the Continental Freemasonry. The charges of the Freemasons in the Old English Freemasonry are very much like the kind of stuff you would expect to see in an American Constitution. Sort of, freedoms and responsibilities and all this sort of stuff. Religious indifferentism, which is bad, ultimately, but the actual conduct that's expected of the citizens is not something that is egregious. Now, if we compare that Old English Freemasonry, which is very much part of the American historical and even Canadian historical tradition, it's very different than the continental European Freemasonry. So England is obviously an island, like Britain's an island, and then continental Europe is the part that's not unattached from Europe, the continent. So continental European Freemasonry was the Illuminized Freemasonry. And this happened actually after the Revolution in America. The illumination with the Illuminism philosophy, which is where we get the term Illuminati, that came in the late 1700s, just after the American Revolution. This is what we see in the French Revolution, which is why it's so much more bloody and so much more aggressive and so much more overtly pagan and very Gnostic. And this is, again, in comparison to the Freemasonry of America. And this is what has happened to Italy. The continental Illuminized European Freemasonry is what has ravaged Italy. And he's exactly correct, Vigano is, to talk about this here as how it's really affected that country. And he says, let us not forget that the French Revolution wrestled the royal crown from Jesus Christ, setting up the alleged rights of man and of the citizen against the sovereign rights of God. Rights that freed from the respect for the natural and moral law now include abortion, euthanasia, even of the poor, as is the case in Canada, sadly, marriage with people of the same sex, marriage with animals, and even marriage with inanimate things. This is actually happening in certain places. And these are all the results of the Freemasonic takeover, ultimately, in Vigano's opinion. There's an interesting question that the interviewer, his last name is Manocchia, he asks Vigano here. He says, the artfully created psychopandemic has produced psychosis, panic, terror, and physical and mental suffering that has left an indelible mark, severe social unrest, something that has never before occurred in such a way in human history. They have reduced man to a zombie. What is the message that can be conveyed in the face of this imposed conforming and formatting of the population? Interesting term there, psychopandemic. I believe he's talking to psychological, not meaning you're a psycho. But anyway, Vigano says, you rightly use the term formatting, which in a certain sense recalls precisely the great reset inaugurated by the psychopandemia, and which today constitutes with the war and energy emergency. Today continues with the war and energy emergency. We must ask ourselves, what may have led entire nations to apostatize their faith, to erase their identity without remorse, to forget their traditions, allowing themselves to be shaped on the model of the Anglo-Saxon idea of the melting pot. This question applies especially to our beloved Italy, disfigured by decades of ideological subordination on the one hand to the French left or Soviet communism, and on the other hand to the neocon American liberalism. Today we see that the Chinese communism and globalist Chinese communism and globalist liberalism have merged together in the Davos World Economic Forum, threatening the whole world and our country in particular. Speaking more about the World Economic Forum, he goes on to say the basic problem that we have is that our governments that we've had have been completely maneuvered by Freemasonry, deciding on reforms, declaring wars, drawing borders, and stipulating treaties, always and only on the orders of the lodges. Notoriously Masonic parliamentarians, Freemason ministers, Masonic university professors, primary Freemasons, senior Masonic officers, Freemason publishers, and Freemason bishops, that's a strong statement, have obeyed the oath of allegiance to the Grand Lodge and betrayed the interests of the Italian nation. Today, Freemasonry avails itself of its quote-unquote secular arm, the Davos Forum, World Economic Forum, which sets the agenda for the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the European Union, the various philanthropic foundations and political parties, and also the Bergoglian Church under Pope Francis. This is really strong statement here. He's not wrong, though, that there have been bishops who have turned out to be Freemasons. You can read about that in Father Charles Murr's book, Murder in the 33rd Degree, firsthand accounts of how that happened. It's interesting, though. He says here that the secular arm of the Freemasons is the Davos Forum, so the World Economic Forum. I have not been able to find any evidence that the World Economic Forum is officially tied to Freemasonry. I haven't been able to find any evidence that Klaus Schwab is a Freemason. Again, this stuff is secretive, so unless someone chooses to out themselves for some reason, there's no way we could know that. But even if it's not official, I think what Vigano is trying to get at here is that those ideas of Freemasonry are personified perfectly in the goals of the Freemasons, of the World Economic Forum. And this corresponds to what we've seen with how the Freemasons have tried to attack the Catholic Church, for example. If you read a document called the Alta Vendita, which you can find online, it was the Freemasonic plot to destroy the church, and it was found in Italy in the late 1800s. And the goal was to have Freemasonry as an ideology spread throughout the world. Membership in the Freemasonic lodges is helpful, but they're more concerned that the ideology of the organization, of the cult, basically, spreads throughout the world so that it takes over. If Vigano was referring to the specific nature of membership of members of the World Economic Forum in Freemasonry, that is something I have no evidence of. But if he's trying to say that this ideology is the animating force, let's say, of the efforts of those groups, then I think he's exactly correct. He continues, he says, but the fact that this coup d'etat is so vast and branched does not imply that it is less real. Indeed, the present situation is very serious precisely because it involves hundreds of nations that are in fact governed by a single elite group of criminal conspirators. On the other hand, there is no need to talk of conspiracy theories. Just listen to what the main architect of the Great Reset, Klaus Schwab, said on May 23 while speaking at the Davos Forum. He said, this is a quote from Schwab, he said, "The future is not built by itself, it is we of the World Economic Forum who will build the future. We have the means to impose the world we want, and we can do this by acting as a stakeholder in the communities and collaborating with each other." I don't know if I fully agree with the Archbishop here in believing, I don't know if Vigano believes this, in believing that we should take the claims of Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum as serious as they'd like us to. I believe they are evil and maniacal. I have a hard time believing that they as a group can sort of pull the strings for the entire world. That's not to say that they're not a group that tries to do that. I'm just not sure if when Klaus Schwab says that they have the means to do it, that we can actually believe that's the case. I think there are a lot of blind spots in all organizations, and taking over the world, so to speak, in a very absolutist sense, is a very basically impossible thing to do, in my opinion. That doesn't mean I'm not saying don't take the Great Reset crowd seriously. They're nuts. But in any case, he then goes on to cite how the current Ukrainian crisis is part of this whole sort of Masonic idea, this dialectic of takeover of nations. And he says the Ukrainian crisis is also part of this plan. With the right narrative, we will use the war to make you green, Schwab's advisor, Yuval Noah Harari, who sums up all the talents of the woke intellectual as an Israeli homosexual vegan animal rights activist who is anti-Putin and anti-Russian as well as fiercely anti-Trump, went so far to state shamelessly, and this is a quote from him, in 10 years, everyone will have a brain implant and eternal life in the digital realm. Google and Microsoft will decide which book we should read, who to marry, where to work, and who to vote for. Yeah, Yuval Noah Harari is insane. I think he's really dangerous, but I also think he's kind of an insane person. When you look into the actual science or the mechanisms behind the science that Harari thinks is there, legitimate scientific experts say that it's kind of just basically fantasy. Nonetheless, Harari's influence on world leaders is actually profound. You can find clips of Barack Obama talking about his love for the book Sapiens, which is basically just almost like mythological or religious text that gives this history of what is believed to be the evolutionary path of man. And then Harari did go on to write a book called Homo Deus, A Brief History of the Future, where it basically, and this is what Vigano calls it, it is the nonsensical raving of the transhuman man who thinks he can defeat death and make himself a god. This kind of reminds me of the parts when we're in these Marvel movies or science fiction movies when there's a villain who basically tries to make himself into God and he always ends up failing, but in any case. He continues about the plight of the Italian people specifically in this drama that we're living through. Vigano does, and he says, the fraud carried out against the Italian people was that of making them believe, beginning in the 19th century, that it was their will to free themselves from the yoke of the tyranny of the various pre-unification Italian states. This is true. Italy is only 150 years old officially as a country, and the revolution that took place in the 1870, I think it was 1870 or around the time of the First Vatican Council, was disastrous. And the country has been reeling ever since. You see, Italy is really a collection of nations. Excuse me. It's old. I mean, there's different languages, dialects, and so on and so forth. And it's ultimately kind of impossible to force those things together by decree. The interviewer asks a couple really strong questions to finish, and I want to end with these because they are very fascinating, and they give us a path forward to understand what's going on here. And the interviewer, Manokia, says, do those who do not accept nihilistic and neo-Malthusian theories, perhaps because they are faithful to the principles of Christianity, risk being removed from positions of power? Vigano says, it is obvious. Those who do not support the psycho-pandemic narrative, gender theory, LGBTQ ideology, the collectivist liberalism of the World Economic Forum, the New World Order, and the Great Universal Religion are ostracized, delegitimized, and passed off as crazy or criminal. True. Any dissenting voice is uncomfortable when power is based on psychological violence and mass manipulation. This is a really profound statement. When he says, when power is based on psychological violence and mass manipulation. That is the weapon of our age. No longer do we have a gulag. We don't need a gulag. We have a technological gulag. You know, if you're a slave and you're working for the state every night by swiping the things they want you to swipe and doing what they ask you to do just because you see it on your Facebook page or something like that, then you may as well be as much in an intellectual slave camp as someone who was in an actual work camp. He continues, he says, it happens to the doctor who does not accept the speranza, that's the Italian health minister protocols, to the teacher who does not discriminate against the unvaccinated. I can say as a former teacher, it happened to the teachers who did not accept the woke agenda in general. To the journalist who reports the truth about the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, it's true, they exist. To the parish priest who does not want to undergo inoculation, and to the cardinal who denounces the enslavement of the Vatican to the Chinese dictatorship. Cardinal Zen. Final question here, though, ends with a path forward, some hope. And he says, speaking of life, and this is the interviewer, speaking of life and the natural law also means talking about the backbone of society, the family. Apart from the declining birth rate, what are the consequences of the economic crisis on the family? And he says, the family is certainly at the center of the globalist attack. Family means tradition, identity, faith, mutual help and support, and the transmission of principles and values. Family means father and mother, each with their own specific role, irreplaceable and not interchangeable, both in the mutual relationship between the spouses and also in the education of children, as well as towards the community. Family means lived religion, religion that is communicated through small gestures, good habits, the formation of conscience, and a moral sense. He says, you can well understand that striking at the family leads indefectibly to the dissolution of the social body, which by nature is incapable of replacing the role of the family. And that is important here. Keep that in mind. He says, the state essentially is incapable of replacing the role of the family. He says, as a result of that, we have divorce, abortion, same-sex marriage, adoption of children by single people or irregular couples, the deprivation of parental authority for ideological reasons, the elimination of grandparents and the relatives from domestic life, working conditions for mothers that do not allow them to perform family tasks, penalization of women who are married and who have children when they seek employment, indoctrination of children beginning in elementary school. In this field, too, courageous and determined action is needed for the defense of the natural family and for the protection of the rights of parents in the education of their children, who are not the property of the state. And I wanted to end with that question because it falls on your shoulders if you're a parent. If you want to stop the Great Reset, if you want to stop the takeover of, X, Y, and Z organization that is spreading Marxist Freemasonic values into your school system, then don't put your kids in it. Educate your kids outside of it. Make the sacrifices you have to make. A lot of people are worried about making that jump where they're going to take their kids out of the system. They think, well, it's too tough because we have two incomes. Listen, what does Christ tell us? What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? That applies to our children as well. Sometimes we have to downsize. We might have to move. We might have to sell our house. We might have to, I don't know, what is the line? How far are you not willing to go in order to make sure your children are protected? I mean, if it comes to the point where it's like, yeah, we got to move somewhere far away because we're not allowed to homeschool in our country, or there's no good private schools or Catholic schools, or, maybe there are public schools and they're good in some places, but you have to move to a different state or province or something, and there's good ones there. I don't know. But Vigano is exactly correct here when he says, your children are not the property of the state. They're not. So do not let the state inculcate your children with the values that you see taking over the world. The demographic cliff that the liberal world is heading towards is very real. Leftists are not having children, whereas people like us are having tons of children. If you have a 10-year-old child, if you have a 15-year-old kid right now who's just in high school, in 10 to 15 years, your kid's age group will be separated in a drastic way that we've probably never seen before between kids like your children who are Christians with maybe they'll have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 kids, who knows, compared to people who don't even know their gender and they certainly are not married or have sterilized themselves or are thinking about messing around until they're 35 years old before they try to finally calm down. The demographic cliff that the leftist world is facing is very real, and it will be approached very soon. And Vigano is exactly correct that in order to fight this Freemasonic takeover of the world, it starts in the home, it starts in the nursery, it starts in the cradle. So, do not despair because of the things that are difficult, because you have the solution to that. As Vigano said, it is impossible. He says this quote here, the state by its nature is incapable of replacing the role of the family. You are the only thing that can be the family to your children, because it cannot be replaced. That is good news, and we should rejoice in that. Okay. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel. Please check out in our description links for Noble Gold. In a time of societal upheaval, it is important to have strong investments. And hey, I'm no financial expert, but look at the history of, you can go through the world wars, the Great Depression, and so on and so forth, and your precious metals, they'll still be there. So that gives you peace of mind. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, click the links in the description, help us grow. Thank you for all your support. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.